Secrets hidden for centuries surface in a quiet village. Mysterious travelers arrive with forbidden scrolls. Ancient rivalries awaken, and one young hero discovers a path that could change history forever. The dawn unfurled slowly over the bustling port of Chuanzhou, a city cradled by the southern coast where the scent of salt water mingled with the earthy aroma of wet timber and freshly baked rice cakes, and as the first golden rays of sun glimmered across the rippling waves, a lone fisherman's boat drifted lazily into the harbor, its worn hull creaking under the weight of an early morning catch, glistening with scales like fragments of moonlight, while behind him the city began to stir, the narrow streets already echoing with the rhythmic pounding of wooden carts on cobblestones and the low hum of merchants haggling over exotic spices, silk, and ceramics brought from distant lands that spoke of kingdoms far beyond the Jade Mountains, of deserts where camels traced silver lines across sand, and of bustling bazaars where coins clinked like rain against the iron roofs. Old Li, the fisherman, inhaled the briny air, feeling the cool mist settle on his weathered face, recalling how, as a boy, he had raced along these same docks, chasing the gulls and weaving between cargo-laden vessels whose sails billowed like great paper dragons, carrying goods from the ports of India, Persia, and even farther west, and today, as he hauled the net onto the dock, the fish slipping and wriggling between his calloused fingers, he could sense the currents of change flowing through Chuanzhou, for the city, once a quiet enclave of wooden houses and tea gardens, now thrummed with the promise and peril of the maritime silk route, where merchants whispered of new wealth and captains spoke in hushed tones of treacherous reefs and bandits that lay hidden along the coastline. Children ran barefoot across the docks, their laughter mingling with the bray of oxen dragging carts laden with salt, soy, and fragrant tea leaves harvested from the terraces further inland, while women with woven baskets balanced on their heads called greetings to each other across the water, offering slices of sweet, glutinous rice wrapped in bamboo leaves and steaming buns filled with pork and scallions, their scent carried by the wind into the narrow alleyways where lacquered doors opened, onto courtyards filled with potted chrysanthemums and small koi ponds reflecting the amber light of the rising sun. In the market, a Persian trader displayed his vibrant bolts of dyed silk, the reds and blues so deep they seemed to pulse in the sunlight, and an elderly Chinese scholar, his robes fraying at the edges but his eyes sharp, fingered the intricate patterns, recognizing the foreign motifs embroidered with threads of gold and silver, while a group of sailors from Fujian whispered about a new ship arriving from the southern seas, its hull said to be carved from the finest teak, capable of braving the monsoon winds and carrying porcelain jars, lacquerware, and rare spices that would fetch fortunes in distant lands, and as the sun climbed higher, painting the wooden balconies and tiled rooftops with fiery light, the air was thick with anticipation and apprehension, for the city had grown restless under the weight of rumor. A fleet from the eastern kingdoms was rumored to be on its way, their purpose unknown, and the docks hummed with the quiet tension of merchants and sailors alike, all aware that fortune and disaster often arrive together, carried by the same wind. Among them moved May, a young woman of 17, her hands deftly arranging baskets of oranges and chestnuts she had gathered from the hillside orchards, her hair tied back with a strip of crimson cloth that caught the light as she bent to lift a particularly heavy bundle, the tang of citrus and the earthy perfume of nuts mingling with the morning air and stirring memories of her mother's stories about the days when the city was a sleepy fishing village, before the foreign ships arrived, before the drums of distant empires beat against their shores, and as May glanced toward the horizon, she caught sight of the masts of a vessel far off, sails unfurling like the wings of a great bird, and for a moment she felt a shiver of both excitement and fear, aware that the arrival of strangers could bring gifts or ruin, friendship or betrayal. Around her, the cacophony of the port continued. A blacksmith hammered iron, sparks dancing like fireflies. A cook stoked a clay oven, and the rich aroma of braised pork and fermented soy seeped into the alleys. Men mended nets, their fingers raw and red from the salt water, while pigeons cooed from the rafters above, pecking at scattered grains. Everywhere there was motion, the sense of a city alive and straining toward something larger than itself, as if the currents of trade, rumor, and human ambition converged on this single harbor. In the shade of an old tea-house near the quay, a group of scholars and map-makers unrolled fragile scrolls, their ink faded but legible, marking the courses of distant rivers, the locations of hidden reefs, and notes on foreign ports where pepper, frankincense, and exotic cloth might be obtained, their voices low and urgent, debating routes and alliances, aware that each line drawn on the paper might dictate the fortunes of thousands, while beyond the walls, the common folk carried on with their daily labors, unaware that these deliberations were already shaping the tide of their lives. A fisherman sold his catch, a child ran with a wooden hoop, a woman poured tea for a weary traveller who had come from the mountains, dusty and sunburnt, seeking passage to a city whose walls promised safety and wealth. As midday approached, the sun hung high and hot, turning the stone streets into warm copper sheets, and the clatter of shutters and the jangle of bells announced the arrival of foreign emissaries, their faces unfamiliar, their clothing exotic, stitched with patterns and symbols unknown to local eyes, their presence causing murmurs of curiosity and caution to ripple through the crowd. They carried gifts of jade and incense, their speech melodic but strange, and children pressed close to their mothers, peering from behind skirts, sensing the strangeness but also the excitement of something new entering their world. At the edge of the harbour, old Lee and May crossed paths, sharing a quiet nod, each aware of the subtle shift in the rhythm of life, the invisible pulse that hinted at the unfolding of events larger than either of them. They did not yet know that the ship on the horizon, its sails taut and creaking, carried a man whose ambitions and secrets would intertwine with their lives, shaping their days and nights, their laughter and their grief. That evening, as the city began to settle under a soft purple twilight, lanterns flickering against the darkening sky, the smell of seaweed and smoke curling from hearths, May walked along the quay, her bare feet brushing cool stones damp from the rising tide, listening to the distant song of a fisherman's flute and the occasional bark of a dog chasing a rat through the alleys, while old Lee repaired his nets nearby, muttering to himself about the seasons and the wisdom of the tides. The air was heavy with expectation, a quiet tension that threaded through every courtyard and rooftop, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the ship drew nearer, slicing through the waves with the inevitability of fate, carrying whispers of distant empires and promises of fortune and danger alike, and as the last light faded and the stars began to prick the sky, May felt a chill run down her spine, the sense that her life, the life of the port, and indeed the currents of the world itself, were about to change in ways that no one could yet foresee. By the time the moon rose, casting silver paths across the harbour, lanterns reflected on water like clusters of fireflies, and the city exhaled the day's heat, winding down into the quiet rhythms of evening chores and bedtime stories whispered in bamboo-walled homes, old Lee sat on the dock, a pipe smouldering between his lips, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, tasting the salt on his tongue, feeling the pulse of the tides beneath his fingers, and in that quiet, he understood that the arrival of the new ship was more than a single event. It was a harbinger of an era, one that would bring strange languages, foreign foods, and unexpected alliances, as well as trials and losses that would test the endurance of hearts and hands alike. And somewhere deep in the harbour, hidden among the shadows of timbered vessels and stacked crates of rice and sugar, he glimpsed a figure, a silhouette against the moonlight, moving with a deliberate purpose, carrying secrets not yet revealed, and he knew, with the slow certainty that comes from years at sea, that the lives of all who dwelled in Chuanjo, from the smallest child to the oldest sailor, were about to be woven into a story far larger than the city itself, a story whose first threads had just begun to shimmer in the twilight, waiting for the dawn to unravel the mystery and reveal the currents that would sweep them into adventure, danger, and change. The first light of morning crept over Chuanjo once more, slipping through the latticed windows of wooden homes and casting golden stripes across the worn stone streets, and already the harbour was alive with movement, the creak of masts and the slap of waves against hulls mingling with the calls of vendors setting up their stalls and the faint, lingering scent of salt, fish, and smouldering incense. The ship that had appeared on the horizon yesterday had docked quietly under the watchful gaze of city guards, its hull dark and gleaming with polished teak, its sails furled but still rippling in the gentle breeze, and a crowd gathered, curiosity and apprehension twining in the air like tendrils of smoke, as men in embroidered robes disembarked, their faces unfamiliar, skin sun-darkened from distant seas, carrying parcels wrapped in oiled silk and wooden boxes sealed with red wax, the faint aroma of cinnamon, cloves, and other spices slipping from them like a promise of faraway lands. While children darted forward, noses twitching, eyes wide with awe at the glittering coins and jewelry that glinted beneath the sunlight, and Oldley watched from the end of the dock, pipe in hand, feeling the familiar tug of destiny along the tides, sensing that the quiet rhythm of the port was about to be disturbed by forces he could not yet name. Among the newcomers was a man whose presence drew more than casual attention, a tall figure with a narrow face framed by a dark, weathered hat, robes embroidered with strange geometric patterns that shimmered when he moved, and eyes sharp as a hawk's, scanning the bustling port with a calm, measured precision that belied the tumult beneath the surface. This was Captain Shan, a trader and navigator of considerable renown, whose voyages to the southern kingdoms and across the eastern seas had earned him both wealth and whispered tales of cunning, and as he stepped onto the dock, the wooden boards groaning under his weight, he immediately began issuing orders to his assistants, a cadre of young men and women who moved with practiced efficiency, arranging crates, checking inventories, and making notes on scrolls dampened slightly from the morning mist. May, drawn by the crowd and the scent of exotic goods, edged closer, her hand resting lightly on the edge of a basket of oranges, curiosity warring with caution, as she watched the captain gesturing toward a large crate, untying the ropes with deliberate care, and the lid lifting to reveal rows of delicate porcelain jars, their surfaces painted with cobalt dragons and lotus blossoms, and vials of rare oils and dried herbs from lands she had only heard of in travellers' tales. The colours, the textures, the unfamiliar scents awakened in her a mixture of wonder and unease, for these objects carried with them not just beauty but the weight of the unknown, the potential for fortune and peril alike. As the day wore on, rumours began to spread through the streets and tea-houses, whispers of Captain Shan's voyage, the rare silks and spices he had brought, and hints of alliances with merchants from distant islands who spoke strange tongues, whose ships had never before been seen in Chuanzhou, and with every retelling, the story grew, carried along by wind, market chatter, and the eager tongues of children who imagined distant lands filled with jungles, deserts, and seas teeming with creatures strange and marvellous. Farmers who had come to the city to sell rice and tea paused in the alleys to peer at the cargo, envisioning the wealth such goods might fetch, while scholars jotted notes in ink-stained notebooks, tracing trade routes and calculating the value of rare imports, and even the guards, stoic and watchful, exchanged murmured theories about the implications of this arrival, sensing that the quiet order of Chuanzhou was slowly being drawn into a larger, more complex world. Amid this tide of activity, May found herself crossing paths with Oldley, who had brought his small boat closer to the quay to repair torn nets, the smell of fish and tar clinging to his fingers, and he spoke in low tones, warning her of the currents of human desire that could be as dangerous as the sea itself, the way ambition, greed, and curiosity often led men and women into risk and conflict, while the city, like the harbour, thrummed with the steady, unpredictable rhythm of life unfolding. He gestured toward the docked ship, noting the precision of Captain Shan's crew, their movements almost choreographed, and hinted that the arrival of such a vessel often marked the beginning of stories that would ripple far beyond the immediate streets, touching lives in ways invisible at first glance. As afternoon approached, the sun turned high and fierce, and the market slowed under the heat, the merchants seeking shade behind stalls and doorways, the air thick with a mingled sense of roasting chestnuts, boiling soy, and the distant tang of sea spray, and the captain's men continued their work, carefully cataloguing the crates, unwrapping spices, and tasting unfamiliar teas with practised attention, their tongues noting subtle notes of cinnamon bark, cardamom, and the sharp fragrance of dried citrus peel, while the city dwellers lingered at a respectful distance, absorbing the foreignness with a mixture of awe and apprehension. In the quiet corners of the quay, deals were struck in hushed tones, a local merchant negotiating the purchase of rare silk from a Persian trader, a young sailor being recruited for an upcoming voyage to the southern islands, and messages whispered from one dockhand to another, carrying hints of future partnerships, rivalries, and secrets hidden within the ornate packages. Every movement seemed to reverberate outward, touching the lives of those who might never set foot on a ship or cross the sea, yet whose fortunes would nonetheless be influenced by the flow of goods and information streaming through the harbour. As evening fell, the harbour took on a softer, more contemplative hue, the sun sinking low and painting the water with molten gold and dusky purple, the distant mountains turning into shadowed silhouettes, and May walked slowly along the quay, her basket lighter now, having traded some oranges for coins with a wary but satisfied merchant. Her eyes following the silhouetted figures of sailors climbing the rigging to secure lines and adjust the last of the sails for the night. The air was cooler now, carrying the mingled scents of the sea, cooking fires, and faintly of incense from a nearby temple, and with each breath she felt the pulse of the city in a way she had never known, as if the entire harbour were alive and breathing alongside her. At the far edge of the docks, Captain Shan stood observing the activity with a keen eye, his posture rigid yet composed, the lines of his face catching the amber glow of lanterns as his mind calculated risks and opportunities, the networks of trade and influence he would weave through Chuanzhou and beyond, and as he spoke in a low, controlled voice to one of his lieutenants, revealing only fragments of strategy and intention, the murmur of waves against the hull and the creaking of timbers became a kind of rhythm, a quiet reminder that every decision, every action, sent ripples across the lives of those present and yet unseen, shaping futures in ways subtle and profound. As night deepened, lanterns reflected in the water, forming golden paths that swayed with the gentle motion of the tide, while the city settled into its softer rhythms. Children slept in bamboo-walled rooms, soot-stained kitchens cooled after the day's labours, and the occasional bark of a dog or the distant cry of a gull punctuated the quiet. Yet the presence of the foreign ship, its crew, and the intricate web of commerce and intrigue they carried ensured that sleep was laced with awareness, with anticipation, and with a faint, thrilling sense of danger. Oldley leaned against the railing, the taste of salt on his lips and the feel of wormwood beneath his fingers, thinking of the countless voyages he had undertaken, the storms weathered, the treacherous reefs avoided by skill and luck, and he sensed, as did May in her own reflective walk along the quay, that the arrival of Captain Shan and his goods was only the first thread in a tapestry that would soon entwine them, the city, and perhaps distant lands, in a story of commerce, adventure, and human resilience. And somewhere amid the shadows cast by lantern light and timber, a small, almost imperceptible movement caught the corner of his eye. A figure stepping quietly along the dock, gloved hands clasping a tightly sealed scroll, eyes scanning the crowd with intent and secrecy, and though unseen by most, this figure carried a message that would ignite a chain of events reaching far beyond Chuanzhou, altering alliances, challenging loyalties, and revealing that even in a city of apparent routine, the currents of fate were swift and unforgiving, ready to sweep all into a voyage neither expected nor entirely understood. The harbour of Chuanzhou lay bathed in the soft, pearly light of early dawn, mist curling along the water like the breath of sleeping spirits, and the city seemed to hold its collective breath as news of the foreign ship's arrival rippled through the streets, carried by merchants, fishermen, and wandering children whose bare feet slapped against the damp cobblestones. The city's usual hum of activity was tinged with tension, a mixture of curiosity and wariness, as the docks teemed with men and women preparing for the day, their baskets brimming with fresh fish, fragrant tea leaves, sticky rice cakes, and pungent spices, and the smell of boiling soy sauce and roasting chestnuts mingled with the salt tang of the harbour air, creating an intoxicating perfume that spoke of both home and distant worlds. May moved along the quay, her hands dusted with the faint powdery sweetness of rice flour, eyes drawn again to the foreign ship, now fully docked, its dark hull gleaming like polished obsidian, and the figures on board busied themselves with unloading crates, each marked with unfamiliar symbols and bound with ropes dyed in reds, blues, and yellows that gleamed in the morning sun. The air was alive with a low murmur of multiple languages, and she could catch snippets of Persian, Malay, and even a tongue that reminded her vaguely of the stories her grandmother told of travellers from the western deserts, the syllables flowing like water over pebbles, unintelligible yet melodic, and somehow urgent. Oldley stood a few steps behind her, leaning against a piling, the scent of tar and wet nets clinging to his hands, eyes narrowed as he observed the careful choreography of the foreign crew, noting the precision of their movements, the almost silent coordination, the way each crate was lifted, lowered, and inspected before being passed along to the waiting dockhands, and he murmured softly to May, warning her that such meticulousness often concealed more than mere commerce. There were intentions behind these motions, ambitions that might ripple outward, touching lives in ways invisible at first glance. In the alleys behind the market, whispers travelled fast. A local merchant who had ventured to the southern islands told of Captain Shan's previous voyages, of treasures acquired through cunning and sometimes questionable means, of storms weathered and rivals outmaneuvered, and as the story spread, curiosity mingled with apprehension, each retelling layering speculation upon fact, imagination upon rumor, until the city itself seemed to vibrate with expectation. In a small courtyard near the Temple of the Sea God, a group of sailors, some local and some foreign, huddled around a low brazier, passing around tea in tiny porcelain cups, their faces lit by the flickering flame, and in the murmur of voices, May heard tales of distant ports, markets overflowing with fragrant spices, bazaars alive with dancers and musicians, forests thick with animals whose skins and bones were highly prized, deserts where the wind carried secrets, and seas so vast that ships seemed swallowed by their enormity, and the young girl imagined herself stepping aboard one of those vessels, the scent of the ocean in her hair, the wind tugging at her sleeves, the rhythm of the waves a heartbeat beneath her feet, and for a moment she allowed herself to dream of the wider world beyond the walls of Chuanjo. Meanwhile, Captain Shan had retired to the small cabin aboard his ship, unrolling scrolls of charts, sketching additional notes, and consulting with his lieutenants. The soft smell of ink and oil would fill the cabin, mingling with the faint aroma of dried citrus and cloves from the cargo, and his eyes traced the lines of distant ports, the marks of reefs and currents, and the faintly scrawled names of trading partners whose loyalty was uncertain. Each decision weighted with the knowledge that one misstep could mean the loss of wealth, reputation, or even life, and as he paused to lift a delicate porcelain jar to the light, noting the intricate cobalt dragon coiling around its surface, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, thinking of the city below, the people whose lives were now entangled with his own, and the unforeseen events that would soon unfold. Across the harbour, a figure moved quietly along the docks, cloaked and cautious, carrying the sealed scroll that had gone unnoticed in the initial bustle, slipping behind barrels and crates with a cat-like grace, eyes scanning the crowd for anyone who might recognize the significance of the message, a warning or an instruction, something that would alter the course of negotiations, alliances, and decisions both here and far beyond the city's walls, and though unseen by most, the careful observer might notice the slight tension in the shoulders, the deliberate pacing, the way the figure's hands did not tremble but moved with intent, and in that small, silent act lay the seeds of intrigue that would soon entangle sailors, merchants, and common folk alike. As midday approached, the sun burned brighter, turning the stone streets to warm copper, and the market became a mosaic of colours, voices, and smells. Women selling steaming buns filled with spiced pork, children running barefoot with kites that fluttered like birds, men chopping firewood with rhythmic precision, the scent of resin and pine smoke drifting from nearby temples, and the constant low thrum of waves against the docks. Everywhere there was motion, yet beneath it flowed an undercurrent of suspense, an awareness that the arrival of foreign traders had shifted the balance, that the patterns of daily life, so familiar, were subtly changing, and that even the smallest actions could echo across the city in unexpected ways. May returned home for a brief respite, carrying a basket now filled with coins earned from trading a portion of her oranges and nuts, her hands sticky with residue, the faint fragrance of the fruit lingering, and as she stepped through the bamboo gate of her family's courtyard, she felt the coolness of the shadows and heard the soft clatter of her mother arranging pots of chrysanthemums, the air thick with the aroma of morning porridge simmering over a small hearth, and she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to imagine the city as it might have been before the ships arrived, before rumours and foreign tongues and exotic goods began to intertwine with the rhythm of her life. Yet even here, the pulse of the harbour was present, carried on the wind, whispering of change, of new stories waiting to unfold. That evening, lanterns were lit across the city, casting warm amber pools of light on the streets and quays, reflecting in the rippling water like scattered fireflies, and the market quieted, leaving the occasional murmur of conversation, the scrape of cartwheels, the distant call of a night bird. Oldley sat near the edge of the dock, his weathered hands folded, watching the silhouettes of sailors moving carefully along the deck of Captain Shan's ship, noting the meticulous inspection of crates, the soft exchange of scrolls and coins, and the faint, almost imperceptible glances exchanged between certain crew members that hinted at secrets and schemes, and he felt the familiar thrill and caution that had accompanied him through countless voyages, the understanding that the arrival of a ship was never just an arrival, but the opening of a chapter, and that even a seemingly minor act, a glance, a word, a handoff, could send waves through the lives of hundreds, altering destinies in ways no one could fully anticipate. The morning sun climbed higher over Chuanzhou, casting long warm rays across the harbor and turning the rippling water into a shifting sheet of molten gold, while the air was thick with a mingled sense of salt, fresh fish, and the faint, spicy perfume of foreign goods newly unloaded from Captain Shen's ship, and the city's rhythm began anew as merchants arranged wares, children chased one another along the docks, and the distant clang of hammers and the creak of cartwheels marked the pulse of daily life. Yet beneath this ordinary bustle, currents of intrigue and ambition flowed quietly but powerfully, unseen by most, as the effects of the night's secret of delivery, the sealed scroll, started to unfold, influencing decisions, whispering through conversations, and coloring the intentions of those who would shape the coming days. May, carrying a small basket of fruits and nuts, wove carefully through the crowd, senses alert, eyes drawn to the ship where sailors moved with deliberate purpose, adjusting sails, inspecting cargo, and whispering amongst themselves in low tones that hinted at alliances, rivalries, and plans not meant for the public ear, while old Li, standing near the edge of the quay, felt the familiar tug of anticipation, the subtle thrill and unease that accompanied the arrival of new information, and he watched as dockhands and merchants carried crates and exchanged murmurs, noting the careful attention paid to particular items, the significance of some goods more than others, and the unspoken hierarchy of who controlled access and knowledge. At the center of it all, Captain Shen orchestrated the day with quiet authority, consulting maps, charts, and notes, the scroll delivered in the night now carefully stored and referenced, guiding his decisions, shaping negotiations, and silently influencing the fates of those who moved around him, unaware of the depth and reach of the intelligence he now possessed. The crew followed his directions with precision, their own understanding of the stakes reflected in the tense set of their shoulders, the watchful glances exchanged across crates, and the careful handling of each item, for even a single misstep could unravel the delicate balance of commerce, alliances, and the fragile trust that sustained it all. Throughout the city, the effects rippled outward. Merchants adjusted prices, weighing potential risks and opportunities. Scholars and scribes noted the sudden influx of rare materials and foreign influences, speculating on their origin and implications. Young sailors and apprentices whispered excitedly of distant ports, of voyages they might one day undertake, of fortunes glimpsed in the glimmering porcelain and exotic spices, while families went about meals and chores, sensing that the ordinary pattern of life had been subtly altered, as if some unseen hand had nudged the city onto a path it had not previously traveled. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the harbor glowed in shades of amber and rose, the water reflecting lanterns that would soon be lit for evening, and May paused on the quay, feeling the warm stones beneath her feet and the gentle tug of the tide, aware that the city held a quiet tension, a suspended moment between what had been and what was yet to come, while old Li, leaning on his repaired nets, nodded knowingly, understanding that the arrival of one ship, one scroll, and one calculated action could ripple through countless lives, shaping destinies in ways both seen and unseen, and as shadows lengthened, the faint murmur of distant conversations, the rhythmic slap of waves, and the whisper of wind through sails carried with them a promise that the currents of change had begun, and the stories of those in Chuanzhou, from the smallest child to the seasoned sailor, were about to be caught in their inexorable flow, moving toward adventure, challenge, and unforeseen revelations that would test courage, wisdom, and the resilience of hearts. As twilight deepened over Chuanzhou, the harbor took on a muted, reflective glow, lanterns swinging gently and casting long, wavering shadows across wet stone and wooden planks, while the air carried the mingled scent of salted fish, roasting chestnuts, and the faint exotic perfume of spices recently unloaded from Captain Shen's ship, and the city seemed caught in a quiet tension. The rhythm of daily life slowed but not halted, as if it sensed the subtle shift that had begun beneath the surface. Captain Shen, seated at his cabin table, examined maps and the night's notes by the soft flicker of an oil lamp, the sealed scroll's contents guiding every decision with an invisible hand, while his crew moved efficiently around him, their steps measured, the occasional murmur of a foreign language blending with the distant cries of gulls settling for the night, and the soft slap of waves against the hull, carrying the constant reminder that even in stillness, the currents of fortune and fate were never truly at rest. May lingered near the quay, feeling the cool spray of water against her skin, eyes drawn to the ship and the movements of the sailors, her heart quickening with the sense that she was witnessing not merely a trade but a quiet orchestration of forces larger than any single person, the city itself a stage where hidden intentions and subtle strategies would soon collide with everyday life, while old Lee, seated on the edge of the dock, watched the interplay of shadows and light, listening to the hushed conversations of merchants, scribes, and sailors, and understood that the day's events had set in motion a chain of influence that would touch lives both near and far, threading through families, trades, and distant ports, and that the stories now unfolding beneath the moon's pale glow would echo for months to come, carrying with them lessons of caution, courage, and the quiet power of those who navigate both the seen and unseen currents of the world.